The United States, our friends and allies in the Middle East, in the entire world, are safer because the threat of a nuclear weapon has been reduced.
Secretary of State Kerry announcing implementation of the nuclear deal with Iran the same day the two countries agreed to a prisoner swap. And it's time now for our Sunday Group syndicated columnist George Will, Carol Lee, who covers the White House for the Wall Street Journal, GOP strategist Karl Rove, and Charles Lane from the Washington Post. Karl, what do you make of the release of these 4 Americans, prisoners, hostages, whatever you want to call them, just as the U.S. starts lifting sanctions against Iran?
Well, I think it's a good thing that they were released. We paid a high price. 7 people have to be pardoned, 14 people have to be not prosecuted, but Americans are coming home. This, frankly, though, is obscuring a bigger issue, and that is Secretary of State Kerry said today marks the first day of a safer world. Why should we believe that? The Iranians have not lived up to a single agreement that they've made. They've tested, since this agreement was arrived at, ballistic missiles in apparent violation of it. They took our U.S. sailors out and, in violation of their international agreements, paraded them for propaganda purposes. And even on the eve of the Secretary's statement, he and the Iranian foreign minister were engaged in a debate about the nature of the centrifuges that Iran, under the agreement, is allowed to develop within the decade that could allow them to develop a nuclear weapon. We're already arguing about whether or not they can go as far as they think they can go in this. So this is not a safer world. It's the first day of a very long, bad period in which the Iranians will take this deal and run with it.
Carol, I want to ask you about what Senator Cruz said and also some of the other Republican candidates, which is basically we traded terrorists, Iranian terrorists. He said, I'm not sure that they're terrorists, but certainly bad actors on Iran's part, some of them convicted of crimes for violating the sanctions, for 4 American hostages. At the White House, where you cover, is there some sensitivity to that issue?
Well, their argument is that they needed to show an act of good faith to get the Americans home, and they had a list of Iranians that were held in the U.S. that Iran gave to them, and they chose these 7 basically because they were not charged with terrorism or any sort of violence. It was violations of sanctions. I think the question for the White House now, and particularly this president going forward with a year left, is where this relationship goes from here. You've had 3 successes in the White House's view this week for diplomacy, the release of the sailors quickly, the Iran nuclear deal being implemented, and now the release of these Americans. And the relationship is really going to be tested in 2 ways going forward. First will be these negotiations that they're having to end the conflict in Syria, which Iran is involved in. And second, what Iran does with this roughly $100 billion of money and how much mischief they make in the world.
Yeah, George, let me pick up on that, because I think that it's fair to say that relations between the U.S. and Iran, already complicated, are going to grow even more complicated. We saw that this week. We got the release of those 10 U.S. sailors. First they were seized, then they were released. Western sanctions against Iran have been lifted, and now we've had the release of the 4 American hostages. What do you make of this relationship?
Well, there's a temptation always to see a pattern in a flurry of events, which is why it's good to remember the post hoc, propter hoc fallacy. The rooster crows and the sun rises, therefore the crowing of the rooster caused the sun to rise. I'm not sure how these things are related. Clearly, there seems to be some relationship between the timing of the lifting of the sanctions and this particular swap occurring. But then you go back a week and people say, well, it was really clever of the Iranians to seize that ship. We don't know whether the ship had engine trouble. We don't know if there was a navigation error. We don't know whether there was a bad decision to send. We don't know how it got there in the first place. Mr. Kerry has decided to construe this as proof that relationships developed while negotiating the nuclear accord are now paying off. We shall see. He also says this proves the power of diplomacy. Well, diplomacy will always work in the sense that it'll reach an agreement if there's an asymmetry of desire. If one side is really eager to get to the end, you'll get to the end. Finally, there's a temptation here, and it's an echo of the Cold War, that we're trying to maneuver between the hawks and the doves in the Kremlin during the Cold War, and now the hawks and the doves in Tehran. I don't know. The supreme leader is supreme. He's not immortal. So we're going to see regime change of some sort in Iran, and until then, it remains very opaque.
Well, and regime change, it doesn't necessarily mean regime change. Just because you replace one supreme leader with another, you'd still have a theocracy.
But when you have a regime as dominated as it is by one man, when you change the leader, you change the nature of the regime.
Chuck, is this the kind of roller coaster we are going to have to expect with Iran, where there are some things that please us, like the quick release of the sailors, like the release not so quick of these 4 hostages, but on the other hand, you know, they continue, as Karl says, to violate the agreement. They've tested ballistic weapons, and in some ways, you know, we are as disturbed by their actions as ever.
Yes, and I would add that the Iranians did something very clever in the midst of all this, which was make a huge order for airplanes from Europe, the Airbus planes.
Yeah, they announced that yesterday.
They are already working to divide U.S. interests from European interests with an eye on the future of any kind of sanctions that might be supposedly snapped back under this agreement. Another group of people who are eyeing all this with concern, of course, are the Sunni Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Arabs, and Turkey, which isn't Arab but is Sunni, who have seen all along in this rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran a threat to the region and a source of instability. All the mischief that Iran is up to, Karl mentioned the ballistic missiles, but those countries I just mentioned are worried about things like the Houthis in Yemen and the disturbances among the Shiite regions of Saudi Arabia. All that mischief is still to be worked out. John Kerry would argue that the Iran deal on nukes makes all that more manageable. I don't think the Saudis would agree.
And Iran is going to have another $150 billion in its coffer if it wants to use it. And some people are saying, well, instead of using it to help the people of their country, they're going to end up using it to create more mischief, and that's a nice word for it around the world.
The good news on that score is the low oil price. That makes this a relatively opportune moment in the sense that Iran will not be able to get maximum revenues right away.
All right, we have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later.